Along the edge of low ground, where land eases down into a sheltered creek, the estuary spreads in a quiet breadth of brown water and dark silt. Marsh grass leans lightly at its edges. Narrow channels wander through the mud and return again to the wider inlet. The air carries that mixed taste of salt and earth, not sharp, only present, a brackish softness resting on timber and stone alike. In such a place, in medieval England or Wales, a tide mill belongs without needing to be announced. It stands where the rise and fall of water can be counted on, where banks can be shaped and held, and where ordinary work can settle into the turning of days. A low embankment crosses part of the creek in a practical line, something between bank and causeway, firm enough in places for feet and the slow passage of carts, and in other places simply built up to hold what the tide brings in. Behind it lies the mill pond. Its surface can look still for a while, carrying a pale reflection of sky or a dimmer one of the mill house, though its stillness is only temporary. The pond exists to keep water in place until the moment when it is needed elsewhere. Set into the embankment is the sluice gate, dark with damp, its posts sunk into bank and channel, its fittings strengthened with iron where wood alone would wear too quickly. It has no need of ornament. It has the plain look of something handled often and watched with care. Mud beside it keeps the print of boots for a time, then softens them again. Weed may gather near the edges. Small drift may rest against the timbers until it is moved aside. The whole scene has the settled appearance of use repeated many times. The action of the mill is simple when seen from outside, simple enough to be told in the movement of water alone. At high tide, water enters and is gathered. It is held in the pond behind the embankment. Later, when the tide beyond has fallen, the stored water is let go again. As it returns toward the estuary, it passes through the mill's working space and turns the wheel. Water is gathered, held, and released. That plain sequence is enough to explain why timber, stone, iron, mud, and grain have come together at this creek mouth and stayed. Nearby stands the mill house itself, not grand, only useful. It may be built of timber or stone or both together, according to local means and later repair. Its lower parts meet damp ground and shifting air. Its boards and posts take in the weather of the coast. Openings are left where light can enter and where sacks can be moved through without too much difficulty. A roof keeps off the worst of the wet. A threshold wears down under repeated passage. The building is part of the same arrangement as the pond and gate, close enough to the water for work, solid enough to hold the machinery and the stones within. Around it, the estuary is not empty margin but working ground. A footpath may cross a firmer bank. A cart track may show ruts where wheels have passed in softer weather and then dried again. There can be grazing land nearby, a reach of salt marsh, perhaps a small landing place where a boat may come in gently when water and weather allow. Nothing here asks to be treated as unusual. The mill sits among other uses of shore and creek. It is one more way in which the place has been shaped to answer everyday needs. Inside or just under cover, a sack of grain waits against the wall. Its cloth is rough and slightly darkened by damp. The weight of it settles into the boards beneath. Meal dust from earlier work lies softly nearby, pale on the floor, caught in cracks and along the threshold. The sack may hold wheat or barley or oats, according to what nearby fields and households have produced and need. It has already passed through other hands and other places before coming here. For now it simply rests in the dimness, close to the millstones that will take it further along its ordinary path. That one sack of grain is enough to join the outer and inner parts of the place. Beyond the doorway lie the embankment, the pond, the sluice gate dark with wet. Within the mill house are boards, fittings, shadows, and the quiet presence of worked surfaces waiting to be used again. The grain belongs to both worlds. It has crossed tracks and thresholds. It has come from dry fields into brackish air, from barn and cart, or perhaps from a small boat at the creek edge into this building, where water will lend its force to stone. The place comes nearer by its materials first. Underfoot, the embankment is not an idea but a shaped length of earth and work, firm where many feet and wheels have passed, damp at the edges where the estuary presses close. Set into that bank, the sluice gate belongs to the same family of things, not decorative, not hidden, simply necessary. Its timbers swell in damp air, its joints take strain. Small debris from the creek may gather against it, so the gate is never only a gate. It is also a piece of timber to be watched, a set of hinges and fastenings to be checked, a surface where the hand can feel rough grain raised by weather and use. Near the water control works lies the wheel space where the stored water is given its task. Water passes with force enough to set a wheel in motion, and that turning is carried inward through wood and weight and repeated contact. The wheel space is darker and wetter than the room above. It smells of soaked wood, old water, and the faint mineral coolness that clings to stone near moving flow. Inside the mill house, the boards and floor carry a soft drift of meal dust. It settles into cracks, pales the darker wood, and gathers along edges where sweeping never quite empties it all away. A sack of grain rests near the wall or threshold, its cloth marked by handling, its weight making a settled shape where it lanes. Wheat may be in one sack, barley in another, oats in another, according to the field's inland and the use intended later. The grain is still whole here, still dry within the woven cloth, waiting for the stones. Those stones form the center of the room's purpose. One remains fixed below, the bedstone broad and steady. Above it turns the runner stone, receiving motion from the machinery and doing the active work of grinding. Grain is fed from a hopper above, falling in a measured way between the stones. Their surfaces are cut with patterned furrows and the raised lands between them, so that grain can be broken down cleanly and the ground meal can move outward as the stone turns. The face of a millstone is rough to the hand, cool when still and serious in its use. Good stone, well kept, gives flour or meal of the expected kind. Worn stone gives poorer work. So the stones must sometimes be dressed. Repeated grinding softens their edges. The patterned face grows less effective. Dressing restores the cut of the surface so the grain is sheared rather than merely pressed, and so the meal moves as it should instead of lingering too long between the stones. In a corner of the mill house, or hung where they can be reached, are simple stone dressing irons and hammers, practical things with no need of ornament. Nearby may be measures for grain, pegs, wedges, lengths of repair timber, and iron fittings waiting for use. The moving parts that carry the wheel's motion to the stones are mostly of wood, fitted and refitted over time. Shafts turn, gears meet and part in repeated contact. Bearings take weight and movement together. Nothing here is untouched by coastal air. Timber drinks dampness and swells. In time it may soften or begin to rot where wet remains too long. Iron rusts slowly in the salt-laden air, darkening first, then roughening. Wooden teeth and surfaces wear by use, not all at once, but by degrees so gradual that care becomes part of the life of the place. A hand on a beam, an eye on a joint, a listening pause near a bearing, these belong to the mill as naturally as the stones themselves. There are heavier, earthier tools too. A shovel leaning by the wall, its blade marked by use in wet ground. A rake or pole for drawing aside what is gathered where flow should be clear. Silt is part of the mill's material life, as constant in its way as grain. It settles in pond and channel a little at a time, soft mud thickening where water slows. If left entirely to itself, it lessens the basin's usefulness and clogs the easy path of flow. So mud must sometimes be shifted, cut, lifted, or dragged aside. The estuary gives the mill its power, and also this patient burden. Everywhere the same few materials repeat in altered forms. Wood in gate, shaft, beam, hopper, and floorboard, stone in wall footing and millstone face. Iron in straps, nails, hinges, and small hard fittings. Water in pond and channel, mud at the threshold of the whole enterprise. Meal dust on the boards, sackcloth folded around grain. Nothing is rare, yet together these things make a durable arrangement. The pond is watched first, not by a clock face and not by an hour that keeps the same place from one day to the next, but by the water itself, by the known habit of the creek, by the rise that comes into the estuary and spreads inward until the basin is full enough to be worth holding. One day the useful time comes earlier, another day later. Over many days it drifts gently, so that the active part of work passes through morning, then toward midday, then farther on, and later returns again. The mill does not resist this, it belongs to it. At high water the pond lies gathered behind the embankment, quiet on its surface, though not still in purpose. The sluice gate stands between what has been taken in and what will be given back. Wet timber darkens where the water has touched it. Iron fittings hold in their places. Enough water must be kept, not too much allowed to pass away too soon. The stored height of water, once lost, cannot be asked back until the tide has made its full round again. So the gate is part of the day's ordinary thought, as familiar as the feel of a board underfoot, or the weight of a sack of grain against the hip. When the tide outside begins to fall, the difference between pond and estuary slowly becomes useful. The outer water lowers by degrees, the held water waits a little above it, then the gate is handled and the quiet surface begins to change. Water presses through, then runs more freely, and below in the wheel space, that released force is turned into motion. The shafts take it, the wooden parts answer one another, and the stones above are brought into their steady labor. The sounds settle into their usual order, first the water at the gate pressing and passing, then the low complaint of damp timber, a creak that belongs to use rather than trouble, then the grinding itself, a continuous rough note from the stones, neither loud nor sharp, but constant enough to fill the room and make the meal dust tremble faintly where it lies on worn boards. A sack of grain set down adds its own brief sound, a soft thud, then another when it is shifted nearer. Grain arrives as need and custom bring it, wheat if a household wants finer flour, barley often enough for bread or for ale, oats too for porridge, for feed, for the simpler uses that are no less regular. Each sack has already passed through many hands and places before it reaches the mill. It has stood in the field, then on the threshing floor, then in a barn, then on a cart, or perhaps in a small boat moving along the creek in calmer weather. By the time it rests near the threshold, with damp air from the estuary touching the outer cloth, it has already lived part of its year. The sack is lifted, loosened, measured. Measures matter quietly. The toll taken for grinding, whether in grain or in money, belongs to the ordinary order of things. In many places such work stands within custom, within the expectations of an estate or manor, within habits long understood by those who bring their grain, so the handling must be fair and seen to be fair. A miller's name rests partly on this plain steadiness, on grain honestly measured, on meal returned in proper quantity and condition, on no more taken than is due. The scoop, the container, the level of grain in its measure, the counted portion set aside, these are as much a part of the day as the turning of the runner stone. After measuring, the grain is brought to the hopper. From there it feeds downward in a controlled way toward the stones. The lower stone remains in place, carrying its share of the work by staying firm. Above it the runner stone turns, and between them the kernels are broken, cut, and reduced. The furrows and flat lands on the stone faces do their patient work, drawing grain inward and moving meal outward. Their condition is part of daily knowledge. The sound tells something. The feel of the meal tells more. If the stones have been well dressed, they cut as they should, and the flour or meal comes away in the expected manner, not too coarse, not overheated, not uneven. So the work continues in repeated gestures. Grain lifted, grain poured, the hopper attended, the stones turning, meal gathering below, another sack waiting its turn against the wall. The boards underfoot are pale with old flour in some places and darkened by damp in others, especially nearer the door where the estuary leaves its trace on boots and hems. Air moves through the mill house carrying two kinds of breath together, the dry softness of ground meal and the brackish coolness from outside. As the wheel turns below, the whole arrangement remains close and comprehensible. Pond behind the embankment, gate in its frame, water descending as the tide recedes. Motion carried upward through wood and iron fittings, millstones at the center of the room's purpose, a sack of grain becoming meal by degrees. Nothing is far from anything else. The mill works because these few parts continue to meet in the right order. There are pauses within the routine, but they are small ones. A hand checks the flow from the hopper. A measure is set straight. A little meal is brushed from the edge of a board. The gate is looked to again because the water in the pond is not endless and the useful force changes as the level falls. The tide outside continues to draw away, and with it the power slowly lessens. This, too, is expected. The mill's strongest working time is never the whole day. It comes, serves, and eases. By then some grain has already changed its form. What entered as hard kernels in a sack returns as flour or meal, gathered and handled, ready to be taken up again. Wheat may leave finer and paler. Barley may come away with its own weight and texture. Oats return in a manner suited to their use. The filled sack does not look entirely new, but it has passed through the turning stones and become something nearer to household need. In that way the mill stands in the middle of many ordinary lives, between growing and eating, between barn and oven, between cart track and table. Just within the doorway the mill house gathers its small world around the stones. It is made to stand where timber stays damp and iron fittings take the salt air, where stone footings may meet wooden walls, or timber framing may rise above a lower course of masonry. Openings are placed where they help the work, a door broad enough for a sack to pass without awkward turning, a shutter or narrow window to admit a workable light, a gap high enough to let the room breathe when meal dust hangs in it. Everything seems arranged less for appearance than for repeated use. The boards underfoot are pale in places with flour and darker in others where damp has entered and dried again many times. Near the stones, the floor holds a soft drift of meal. Near the wall, the timber is marked by hands, by shoulders, by the brushing edge of sackcloth. A hopper waits above the rough round presence of the millstones. Nearby stand measures for grain, plain and necessary. In a corner there may be a shovel for silt or chaff, some simple repair materials, tools kept close because wood swells, fittings loosen, and a working place is always being put right in small ways. A sack resting against the wall has its own weight in the room. One leans beside another, not in neat display but in the ordinary order of a place where things are set down, shifted, opened, tied again, and carried out. The cloth has taken on the smell of grain and the dampness of the coast. It brushes the wall, leaves a little dust where it rests, then is lifted or dragged a little farther across the boards. The floor remembers this. Long use has polished some paths and roughened others. The repeated movement from doorway to measure, from measure to hopper, from hopper back toward the waiting sacks, has made a pattern that needs no marking. At the threshold, that pattern becomes especially clear. The sill is worn lower at its center, not by one season but by many crossings. Pale meal gathers on one side, and on the other side lies the darker trace of the estuary carried in on boots and cart wheels, and the lower edge of sackcloth. Here the indoor work meets the outdoor ground in a narrow strip of wood. A sack may pause there for a moment before being turned inward. Later, a sack of meal may rest in the same place before being lifted away. The threshold is a small thing, but it joins the whole arrangement together. Stone, grain, water, mud, and timber all passing over the same line. Outside, the ground does not become separate from the mill. It remains part of the same working space. Close by lies the pond edge where held water waits behind the embankment. The bank is not only a boundary, it is a route walked often, a place watched for changes in mud, weed, and the line of the water. The gate belongs here in the open air as much as in thought. It is reached by familiar steps from the mill house, along boards or packed earth, over ground that can be firm one week and softer the next. The embankment extends this path further. On one side lies the pond, contained and useful, its surface sometimes still enough to reflect a pale sky. On the other side spreads the estuary, broader and less contained, with creek water moving through channels and the marsh lying low beyond. The causeway holds these two conditions beside one another. It is structure and path at once. Feet pass over it. Carts may approach by it where the ground allows. Its top may be worn by traffic, its sides softened in places by damp and silt, and its edges watched in the ordinary course of upkeep. From the bank, the mill can be seen as part of a larger but still closed landscape. The estuary is working ground itself, with changing mud lines, wet footing, creek edges, and patches of salt marsh. There may be firmer strips where a footpath keeps to the margin of the marsh, bending around wetter places. There may be places where grazing land begins a little higher up. The path is narrow compared with the cart approach, but no less useful. People come by the firmer edges because they have always come that way, carrying small loads, leading animals, or simply crossing between settlement and shore. The cart track arrives by another texture. Its ruts hold water after damp weather and dry unevenly when the air is milder. Wheels have pressed the same route until the ground has accepted it. A cart bearing grain moves more slowly over such an approach than over a hard road, but the track leads where it needs to lead, toward the threshold and the waiting room inside. If local custom or manorial habit directs certain tenants to this mill, that custom is felt here not as a written rule but as repeated arrival. Familiar carts, known footpaths, the same turning place near the door. At the creek edge, where water offers another road, the working space opens again. In calmer conditions, a small boat may come in with grain or leave with meal, using the estuary's quiet channels instead of longer travel over land. The landing place need not be more than a practical bank, a short stretch where a boat can come near enough for passing sacks by hand. Boards may be laid for footing, or the bank itself may be used when the mud is manageable. Here too the estuary does not stand apart from labor. It receives the boat, stains the hem of garments, grips at boots, and then releases them. A sack lifted from a boat carries with it a little damp from the creek and is soon under the mill roof. Light and weather move across these same surfaces, and in that movement the year becomes visible without ever leaving the same small ground. The worn sill takes meal dust in one season and damp grit in another. The boards inside the mill feel dry soft under a pale drift of flour, then later cool and a little swollen from the air off the creek. Beyond the doorway, the estuary is never quite the same color twice for long. It lies gray, then brown, then silvered, then dull again, while the gate remains in its place between pond and outflow, marking time more faithfully than any spoken count. The year here is made by two returns that never quite match and never quite stop. One is the broad turning of the farming months, with sowing far behind, harvest approaching, harvest passing, and stores settling into barns. The other is shorter and closer, the rise and fall of the tide, coming in, standing, and drawing away again. The mill belongs to both. A sack may arrive because fields have yielded and threshing has been done and grain has been dried and stored. Yet the grinding of that grain waits not for a fixed hour but for water. Milling follows the tide, and so the useful part of the day slips gently forward or backward as the month goes on. Because of that, the same acts are repeated under changing light. One day the pond is held full in early brightness, and another day in the dimmer part of afternoon. On some mornings the gate has already done its work before the marsh is fully clear of mist. On other days the handling of it belongs to later hours, when the creek has a flatter gleam. Water is kept at the high tide, then let go when the level outside has fallen enough for the stored weight to move with purpose. The wheel turns from that released water, and the mill answers in its usual way, timber under strain, stone over stone, meal gathering where grain had been. As summer leans toward harvest, the mill may feel a little expectant without becoming busy in any sudden way. The same corners wait, the same hooks, measures, boards, and stone faces remain in place. Then, after the cutting and carrying in the fields, more grain begins to appear. A sack set down on the threshold is not only a load of wheat or barley or oats. It is the quiet end of earlier labor done elsewhere, stalks standing in wind, sheaves bound, grain beaten free, chaff parted from kernel, storage made ready in barn or loft. By the time the sack reaches the mill, much has already been finished. The mill receives what the fields have prepared. Different grains pass through with their own ordinary uses close behind them. Wheat may be wanted for finer flour. Barley comes with the thought of bread or ale. Oats belong easily to porridge and to feed. They do not arrive as a list, but as part of the season's flow, one sack after another, each with its own weight and feel against the shoulder or the hand. The meal dust that gathers on boards in these weeks is still the same pale dust, yet it comes from a fuller round of work. The hopper empties and fills again. The stones keep their patient turning. Outside, the estuary receives the spent water and waits for the next rise. Then the air cools, the marsh grass loses some of its softness of color. Damp settles more firmly into timber, rope, and sackcloth. The gate, so often handled already, asks for little more attention now, not because anything unusual has happened, but because wood in a coastal place is always changing by degrees. It swells, dries, rubs, loosens, and holds again. Its fittings gather the effects of salt air and use. Weed may press against the works after rougher weather. Driftwood may rest where the outflow narrows. Along the embankment and the pond edge, a careful look becomes part of the season, as ordinary as lifting a sack or sweeping meal from a board. Winter does not erase the mill's habits, it only lays a colder hand on them. The causeway is still underfoot, the pond still fills. The estuary still falls away from the bank and returns to it, but inspections become more noticeable because the surfaces themselves ask to be read. A little strain shows in a gate post. A little wear appears where water has worked at an edge. The embankment is walked, the pond margin looked over, the gate checked where it meets its frame. None of this needs to be hurried. It belongs to the same patient care by which the mill remains useful. Within the mill house, maintenance has its own seasons as well. There are times when the stones are not left simply to turn as they are, but are attended to so they will continue to grind cleanly. The face of a millstone, with its cut pattern of furrows and lands, does not keep itself forever. After enough use, it must be dressed again. The work is dry, stony, and close at hand, another kind of repetition among the larger ones. The aim is plain enough, that grain should be cut properly, that meal should move outward as it ought, that the flour not be spoiled by dullness or excess heat. So the stone face is renewed, and afterward the familiar sound returns with a slightly fresher steadiness. Spring comes not as a sudden opening, but as a soft change in the same tasks. Light lingers longer on the pond, the marsh edge looks less hard, water still presses at the gate, but the air around it is easier. This is also when the slower work of mud becomes more visible. Silt has been gathering in pond and channel all along, a little at a time, laid down so gradually that only the season makes it plain. Clearing it is unremarkable work, though necessary. Mud is shifted, channels are eased, and the useful way of the water is kept open. Boots mark the wet ground, shovels lift what the tide has left. The estuary, which gives and receives the water, leaves its fine brown trace on every such task. Beyond the mill room and the gate, the estuary continues the same work in a broader form. It is not empty space around the building, but useful ground and useful water, shaped less by straight lines than by habit. The creek bends inward where the tide reaches. Marsh grass stands on the higher edges. Firmer strips of bank carry footpaths that have been used often enough to become plain without being formal. Between these paths and the causeway, the ground changes underfoot from packed earth to damp mud, and then to boards at the doorway where a sack may be set down for a moment before being lifted again. Around the creek there may be grazing ground where animals feed on the firmer marsh edge, and beyond that the fields from which grain has come. A sack resting in the mill is never only a sack. It carries with it the earlier quiet labor of sowing, cutting, gathering, threshing, storing. It may have stood first in a barn, then in a cart, then under cover at the mill. In some places it may also have crossed a short reach of water in a small boat, moving along the creek in calmer weather when that was easier than a longer road. By the time it reaches the hopper and then leaves again as meal or flour, it has passed through several ordinary hands and over several ordinary surfaces: field stubble, barn floor, cart bed, landing place, threshold, board. The little landing places along such water need not be more than a practical edge where a boat can come near enough for loading. A plank, a worn patch of bank, a place where feet have gone down often and returned carrying weight, these are enough. In settled whether a small boat may bring grain inward or carry meal outward. The journey is short and local, following the bends of the estuary toward a nearby cluster of houses, a wharf of no great size, or another bank where a path continues inland. The mill remains what it is, a working mill beside a muddy creek, but the water gives it another route, and that route joins the others. So the place is crossed by several kinds of movement at once. There is the cart approach, rutted and slow, where wheels press into softer ground after rain and dry a little on higher stretches. There are marsh-edge footpaths, narrow and repeated, carrying lighter traffic between bank, pasture, and settlement. There is the creek itself, which in easy conditions allows a boat to come near with less strain than a road over uneven ground. All these ways meet near the gate and the mill house, because that is where grain changes form. A sack arrives heavy and whole. It leaves divided into meal or flour, measured out, lifted again, and sent onward toward household use. That household use is never far from the meaning of the place. The mill stands between harvest and table, between barn and bakehouse, between stored grain and daily food. Even when the work inside is reduced to repeated motions and familiar sounds, the wider purpose remains plain. The turning stones, the measured toll, the careful handling of grain, all belong to ordinary eating and keeping. The estuary, the gate, and the sack of grain are linked by that plain necessity. In many places the route to this mill was shaped not only by convenience but by custom. Within a manor, tenants might be expected, or at least strongly directed by long habit, to bring their grain here rather than elsewhere. The fee could be taken in grain or in money, according to local practice. Such arrangements varied from place to place, but the general effect was simple enough. The mill was woven into village life by use, by expectation, and by the small regular claims that accompanied service. A sack brought to the doorway carried not just the weight of the harvest, but also the quiet knowledge that milling belonged among the ordinary dues and obligations of the year. Written records where they survived from medieval England and Wales preserve this side of the mill in a quiet way. A page may note dues, rents, measures, repairs, rights, or payments connected with the mill. Such entries do not change the feel of the place, they confirm it. They show the tide mill not as an oddity at the edge of the marsh, but as a dependable piece of local infrastructure, one that required upkeep and brought return. On paper, as on the ground, the mill sits among other useful things: fields, paths, banks, livestock, boats, and households. Across years, the mill does not remain unchanged. It remains by being altered a little at a time. A gate swells in damp weather and dries again. Its boards take the pressure of held water. Iron fittings rust and are renewed. Hinges or pins are adjusted. A post may begin to soften with rot and then be replaced, while the act itself stays the same. Water gathered at the right moment, water released at the right moment, the pond giving back its stored force to the wheel before the flow returns to the creek. One gate may not be the first gate, but the gate remains, year after year, as a familiar object in a familiar place. The same is true within the mill house. A roof needs patching where damp has worked its way in. A board underfoot grows smooth, then weak, then is set aside for another. The mill stones, central and heavy, are not left to themselves forever. Their faces wear with use and must be attended to so they continue to cut grain cleanly. Other wooden fittings near them feel the same salt air, the same dust of meal, the same strain of repeated motion. The mill is durable, but not because it escapes wear. It is durable because wear is expected, noticed, and answered in turn. On the ground there are embankments, channels, footings, wheel spaces, timbers, banks shaped by labor and water together. On the page there are rents, repairs, measures, and customary dues. Neither form needs to stand alone. A note about mending the gate suits the site of a gate post set firm beside the pond. A line about grain tolls suits the memory of a sack lifted from cart or boat and carried across the same threshold that many others crossed before it. The estuary remains the steady outer edge of all this. It receives what leaves the wheel. It presses weed and drift against the works after rougher weather. It lays down silt in channels and at pond edges so slowly that the change may be noticed only after many tides have passed. Yet the slowness does not make the task vanish. Mud must sometimes be cleared. Channels must be kept open enough to serve. A pond too filled with silt holds less useful water. A narrowed flow does less work. So part of the mill's long life is made not of grand rebuilding, but of shovels in mud, boots on the bank, and the ordinary labor of keeping water room to move. If the local conditions continue to favor it, the place continues to. The creek still rises and falls with enough regularity. The bank still holds a pond. Nearby fields still produce grain enough to make the journey worthwhile. Carts can still approach by worn tracks, and in calmer weather a small boat may still come along the creek. Under those conditions, renewing a fitting, replacing a timber, or reshaping a muddy edge is not the making of a new thing. It is the carrying forward of an old arrangement that still answers a need. That is why a sack of grain remains such a steady sign of continuity. The timber around the doorway may be newer than it once was. The embankment may have been raised, patched, or faced again. The gate may have passed through more than one set of boards and ironwork, but the sack still arrives from the same larger pattern of field, threshing, storage, cart, and household. It still comes to this middle place between harvest and use. It still rests for a moment under cover while water is held behind the gate. It still crosses the threshold where meal dust gathers. Over long stretches of time, what remains is often not a whole building standing clear in every part, but a set of durable hints close to the ground. An embankment still holds a line across a creek. A channel keeps its shape where water once moved in and out with purpose. Stone footings stay low and firm under grass or mud. A wheel space may be read in a hollow, a narrowing, a framed edge. Timber traces survive darkened by damp, or else as reused pieces set into later work, still bearing the memory of wet service. The estuary helps and hinders at once. It softens corners, stains wood, buries smaller things, and yet keeps the shape of banks and cuttings long after the busiest days have passed. The surviving remains of tide mills show places made for ordinary use. They suggest practical works built to hold water, release it, and grind grain again and again. The earth itself can still show this repeated purpose. A bank is too straight to be natural. A pond edge curves in a way that answers to storage rather than accident. The narrowed watercourse near the gate keeps the memory of control, of water once held back and then allowed through. Even when the gate boards are gone or changed, the place where the gate stood remains easy to feel. Inside the mill house, where any part survives in record or trace, where gathers in quieter ways. A threshold becomes smooth from the dragging and lifting of many sacks. Boards hold a pale dusting of meal in the grain of the wood. Posts near the doorway or near the hopper are rubbed by passing hands. Corners used for tools or measures settle into habit, and habit leaves a mark more slowly than a blade or hammer. The image of a sack belongs here even when the room has grown still. It rests under cover for a moment, heavy and familiar, linking field and barn to stone and household. Weather leaves its patient record too. Winter water presses against the embankment and asks for mending. Spring tides strain the edges and leave drift caught near the gate. Wooden parts swell, then dry, then soften toward rot. Debris gathers where the flow narrows. Silt settles in pond and channel in a slow, almost level way, reducing depth by degrees. Repairs become part of the fabric just as surely as original building. A line in an estate account noting money for a gate, timber for a roof, work on stones, or labor at the bank belongs to the same world as the rubbed threshold in the darkened timber. Measures of grain, tolls taken in kind or coin, rents, rights, and small expenses all preserve the mill in a quiet way. They show continuity. So the place persists in fragments that still agree with one another. The bank holds its shape. The estuary presses close and leaves its stain. The gate remains tangible as groove, post, fitting, or narrowed run of water. Somewhere in thought, as naturally as in the old room itself, a sack waits under cover. And gradually the named traces begin to matter less than their surfaces. The gate dark with damp, the bank holding its line, the suggestion of a sack resting in shadow as the whole place settles into wood, stone, mud, and faint rhythm. The bank keeps its line and the estuary stays close to it. What had seemed from farther off, like many connected tasks, now rests in a smaller pattern. There is the mill house with its worn boards and dim corners. There is the pond held back in its basin. There is the gate, dark with damp, its timber swollen a little by water and weather, its iron fittings quiet against the wood. Near the wall where it was set down and left for its turn, there is a sack of grain, its coarse cloth folded into itself under its own settled weight. These few things are enough to hold the place. Water gathers behind the gate and waits, then in its time it is let through and lowered away. The motion is simple and returns to itself. Held water, released water. A turn beginning in the wheel below, carried inward through the mill's familiar parts, and then the water passing on again toward the estuary. After a while, the pond is still. After a while, it fills again. The pattern matters more than any single hour in which it happens. The gate remains the clearest point of contact between stillness and motion. Wet timber, a seam where boards meet, iron fixed into wood, water pressing not sharply, only steadily against the barrier that keeps it. Then water easing past, finding its narrow way and widening below. Along the posts and grooves, damp marks remain. The wood is rubbed by use and darkened by brackish air. It has been opened and closed often enough that the movement feels ordinary even in stillness. The gate belongs there as naturally as the mud at its foot. Inside, the mill house holds to a few durable details. The floorboards are worn smooth in some places and rougher in others where grain dust settles lightly. Meal has drifted into cracks and along edges. In the dimmer corners, tools and small things rest without drawing attention to themselves. Openings in the wall admit a little air from the creek side, and that air carries dampness inward, where it meets the dry softness of ground meal. The room is practical, reduced by repetition to surfaces that have received the same motions many times. The sack of grain waits without complaint. Its cloth is thick and plain. The tied mouth is creased from handling. Within it, the grain presses downward into a shape that the boards beneath have learned well. One sack resembles another, and that sameness is part of the quiet of the place. Before grinding, the grain rests. After grinding, meal gathers and is measured out again. The sack is always near the center of things, even when untouched, because it contains the next small turning of work. The stones remain vivid by their surfaces. The lower stone keeps its place. The upper stone turns above it. Between them, grain falls from the hopper and is changed by pressure and roughness into meal that moves outward. The dressed face of the stone is not smooth but cut and patterned for use, its furrows and raised lands doing their old work without display. Even when still, the millstones suggest motion. Even when turning, they do not seem hurried. They are stone acting through repetition, rough against rough, reducing grain into something finer. A little meal dust lies on the boards, pale against darker wood. It settles on ledges, on the edge of a measure, on the base of a post. It softens the room without changing it. Nearby, the sack remains substantial and closed, while the meal is loose and light, already on its way toward another form of use. Between the two lies the work of the stones, repeated so often that it seems less like an event than a condition of the place. Outside again, the estuary receives what the mill returns to it. Water that was held in the pond goes back by shallow channels and dark mud lines. The bank is soft in places, firmer where feet have passed. The mud keeps marks for a while and then loses them. At low water, the channels show themselves more clearly, threading through the flats. At higher water, edges blur. The estuary is not separate from the mill's work. It is the returning place of the water, the broad damp margin against which the embankment and gate make their useful shape. After a while, even the records and repairs feel farther away than the surfaces themselves. Stronger than ink is the rubbed threshold, the darkened timber, the rough face of stone, the place where a sack has rested many times. Older work remains easiest to feel through weight and wear. A board has thinned under passage. A post has taken the polish of hands and damp air. The estuary has left its stain along the lower edge of things. So the mill narrows into its simplest arrangement. Wood, stone, iron, water, mud, and grain, the gate holding and releasing, the sack waiting and then lightening, the stones fixed and turning, the mill house dim around them. Beyond, the estuary lying close under a quiet sky, receiving the water back again. The day's motions thin away, and the familiar parts remain in place. The gate dark with damp, the pond holding a quiet surface, the mill house standing above the creek mouth. Nothing in the scene asks to be hurried now. The embankment keeps its low line across the water, shaped by use and by patient repair, and the pond lies behind it with a steadiness that seems almost held in the timber itself. Beyond, the estuary opens in soft flats and narrow channels, not empty, only quiet, with marsh edges dimming as the light lowers. The same water that was gathered and kept will ease away again in its time. That old pattern remains in the place even when no hand is on the gate. The gate is enough to hold much of the mill in it. Wet wood, iron fittings, the dark seam where water has touched and touched again. It has swelled in damp weather and dried a little in clearer air. It has been watched, lifted, set, and checked so often that the post beside it is smooth where hands have found it. Even at rest it belongs to motion, because water presses, then loosens, then returns. The tide does not stop at the gate. It only pauses there, takes shape there, and passes on. Inside the mill house the air has settled. Meal dust lies faintly on boards and in corners where tools are kept. The rough face of a millstone is still now, but not strange in stillness. It remains what it has long been, a working surface of stone, close to the floor, close to the grain that came in sacks and left in finer form. The boards underfoot are worn where weight has crossed them. Near the doorway the threshold is rubbed smooth, with meal on one side and damp traced in from the estuary on the other. Openings toward the creek admit the last pale light, enough to show the grain of timber, the edge of stone, the plain shape of storage corners. Under cover, one sack remains where it was set down. Its weight is ordinary, and because it is ordinary it gathers many other things into itself. Field work long finished, threshing done, grain measured, lifted, carried perhaps by cart over a rutted way, perhaps by a small boat along a creek in calmer weather. Now it rests against a wall in the mill house, close to wood, stone, and iron, waiting without urgency. Cloth holds the shape of what it contains. The boards beneath take that weight, as they have taken many such weights before. The estuary remains close to everything. It lies below the bank, receives the water back, leaves its stain on lower timbers, and marks the edges of the working ground. Soft mud keeps a print for a little while and then lets it go. Shallow channels gather the fading light. Marsh grass at the edges moves very little. A landing place for a small boat, a footpath over firmer ground, the top of the causeway, the pond edge, the gate post, the doorway, all of them belong to one small arrangement. The mill was never apart from this water and mud. It stood by shaping one part of it into use. The mill house does not need activity to be understood. It is enough that the openings face the creek, that the floor carries a faint softness of meal dust, that stone and timber remain near each other in practiced order. The The rough millstone face, the storage corner, the boards marked by dragging sacks, the post polished by touch, all keep the shape of repeated days. The gate outside, the pond behind, the estuary beyond, these are not separate sites but one joined place. Light lowers a little more and surfaces become simpler. Stone grows plainer, timber darkens, iron gives back less of the day. The pond holds a dim reflection without insisting on it. The estuary softens into broad bands of wet ground and shallow water. The sack under cover keeps its quiet outline. Nothing new enters, nothing needs to. What remains is the settled arrangement itself. Embankment or causeway, pond, gate, mill house, and the estuary beyond. Water held and water released, not as a task now, but as a continuing habit of the place. Wood, stone, iron fittings, water, mud, meal, dust, and grain, near one another as they have been through many seasons. The worn threshold, the smoothed post, the marked boards, the soft bank. The estuary breathing with the tide, the gate dark with damp, the mill house quiet above it, and under the roof, the still weight of a sack of grain resting where work has left it. There is only the settled shape of bank, gate, pond, and roof, with water, mud, timber, and the still weight of a sack of grain resting where the tide leaves them.